You've probably heard it. Japanese soldiers feared American war dogs more than the Flamethrower. It's one of those World War II claims that travels fast because it pairs two specific things, because it sounds like something a veteran might have said in a debriefing room in 1945, because it has the texture of a fact someone actually went and found. We went looking for the source. We checked after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and the memoirs of the men who ran the program. We could not locate the Japanese account that confirms the claim. No captured document, no interrogation record with a name attached. What we found in the American records was something different documented Japanese behavior toward war dog teams that does not look like fear. What it looks like is something else entirely. But before we get there is a fact about this program that almost no one who shares that claim knows. In November of 1942, the same month the Marine Corps began training Dobermans at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, the United States Army was running a second dog program on a barrier island off the coast of Mississippi. Secret. Accessible only by boat. Ringed from public view by alligator marsh and open water. 27 men who took part in it were ordered not to discuss what they had witnessed for the next 10 years. The reason why would not become public until after the war. This documentary is about both programs. What each one asked, what each one was willing to do to find the answer, and what the documented record actually shows about dogs, about the Pacific, and about the question that everyone keeps getting wrong. A Cat Island, November, 1942. In early November of 1942, a detachment of Nisei soldiers from the 100th Infantry Battalion was flown under military escort to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. The men were not told where they were going. They were told only that their mission was classified and that they were not to speak of it. They were built around 25 enlisted men from Company B, 100th Infantry Battalion, separate Nisei men, second-generation Japanese Americans, most of them from Hawaii, accompanied by officers and supporting personnel. They had already been stripped of their right to bear arms once, after Pearl Harbor, their loyalty questioned at the institutional level before it had been tested at any personal one. Then that right was restored. They were inducted, trained, shipped to the mainland. They had done everything asked of them. Now military police were escorting them to a destination nobody would name. They were taken to Ship Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi coast, where they were billeted in barracks thick with mosquitoes. Each morning a boat ferried them across several miles of open Gulf water to Cat Island, where the training took place. Cat Island was subtropical heat, standing water alligator marsh. 400 dogs were kept there. A Swiss dog trainer named William A. Prestre ran the program. Prestre had presented a theory to the United States Army. Dogs, he argued, could be trained to detect and attack Japanese soldiers by smell alone because Japanese people carry a distinct racial scent, different enough from Caucasians, that a trained animal could reliably distinguish enemy from ally in the dark in the jungle, at ranges no human sense could match. The theory had a scientific framing. It had no scientific foundation. It was at its core a pseudo-scientific claim built on racial assumption, the idea that ethnicity produces a characteristic biological signature distinctive enough to function as a targeting mechanism for a dog's nose. The Army accepted the theory. Later accounts suggest the idea reached the highest levels of the Roosevelt administration. The experiment needed human subjects who were Japanese. The Army found them inside the 100th Infantry Battalion and sent them to Ship Island with MPs and a classification order. The Nisei soldiers were given padded protective gear enough to prevent serious injury, not enough to make what followed comfortable. Their job was to serve as the quarry. They hid in the swamp. They climbed trees when the dogs got close, and the alligators made the water impassable. When a dog found them, they fell dead, lying still, while hunks of horse meat placed at their necks rewarded the animal for the contact. The idea was classical conditioning. Pair a Japanese face with a food reward repeat until the dog associates the two, then remove the food and test whether the association holds under field conditions. Yasuo Takada. One of the men wrote about the early weeks. In the beginning, training scout dogs was fun. All we had to do was to hide ourselves in the jungle with a jar of horse meat. Then the dogs began to lose interest. They had spent weeks with the same men. Familiarity is a biological fact. Dogs differentiate by individual scent, by diet, by the accumulated chemistry of daily proximity. The Nisei soldiers ate American military rations. They lived in American barracks. They had spent a year inside the American military environment. Whatever Prestre believed about racial scent, the dogs were smelling something else, these specific men in these specific clothes, eating this specific food. They were not detecting Japanese soldiers. They were detecting their handlers. The aggression Prestre needed was not building, so he ordered the Nisei soldiers to hurt the dogs. To provoke a reaction the training could not produce on its own. The National Park Service account of Cat Island states this plainly. The order was carried out against the desires of the men. They complied. They hurt animals they had no wish to hurt on the instruction of a man whose theory they had no reason to believe in under a classification order that meant they could tell no one. After a failed demonstration in January 1943, the Army abandoned Prestre's attack dog experiment. Cat Island continued training dogs for other wartime roles under the Quartermaster Corps, but the racial scent premise was finished. No announcement was made to the men. No explanation given. Major Jim Lovell, commanding officer of the 100th Infantry Battalion, looked back on it years later. In retrospect, one has to wonder how a president ever came to buy the theory that blood and sweat smelled differently, one race from the other. The dogs had done what dogs do. They had differentiated by diet, by familiarity, by individual chemistry, not by race. The premise had been wrong from the first day, not wrong in the way experiments sometimes miss a variable and require adjustment, but wrong in the foundational sense the thing being measured did not exist. There was no racial scent differential. There had never been one. Rei Nosaka, one of the participants, later described what the classification order had meant for the men. This was so top secret that for 10 years we were not allowed to talk about it. After the experiment ended, Nosaka and the others rejoined the 100th Infantry Battalion's mainland training pipeline. The experiment was simply over, and the paperwork was sealed, and the men carried the knowledge of what they had done on that island into a war that was now their own to fight. By September of 1943, the battalion was in Italy. In the same month they had arrived on the Mississippi coast. November of 1942, a different program had already started. At a Marine Corps base in North Carolina, with a different question. Of the other program, same month. Later that same month, on the 24th of November, 1942, Marine Corps Commandant Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb signed an order. The Marine Corps would train war dogs. The program would be housed at Camp Knox on the New River at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And it would ask a fundamentally different question than the one being pursued in the Mississippi swamp. The Army had asked, what can a dog smell about the enemy? The Marine Corps asked, what can a dog detect? The difference is the entire story. A dog's nose contains roughly 300 million olfactory receptors. A human nose contains approximately 6 million. But the Marine program was not interested in using that differential to sort humans by ancestry. It was interested in using it to detect movement presence and approach things any human being produces, regardless of ethnicity, when moving through jungle at night. The system the Marines built was designed around one core mechanism, the silent alert. A dog trained to the silent alert does not bark. It does not growl. When it detects a human presence in the tree line through scent, carried on the wind through the sound of a boot, on wet ground through the vibration of weight shifting in the undergrowth, it freezes. Body rigid. Hackles raised, nose pointed toward the source. It holds that position until the handler reads it. The handler does not look at the jungle. The handler looks at the dog. That was the entire system. The jungle was unreadable. The dog was not. Training took 14 weeks. The first task was to undo what civilian life had built into the animal. A dog raised in a house is trained by accident, by repetition, by years of positive association to treat loud noise as a signal to respond to retreat to bark. That instinct is useless in combat and lethal on a patrol. The training program ran the dogs through artillery fire, small arms close range, explosions, sustained noise at volumes that would send an untrained animal into flight response, repeated until the dog stopped reacting, until the noise became background and the dog's attention remained on the handler on the tree line on the specific job it had been trained to do. The dogs wore 2 different collars, one for working, one for rest. The distinction mattered more than it might seem. A dog that cannot distinguish between operational deployment and downtime cannot be trusted as a sensor. A dog that understood the difference was a precision instrument. The collar was the signal. 3 primary roles emerged from the training. Scout dogs moved at point ahead of the patrol column and delivered the silent alert when they detected a threat human presence movement in the undergrowth, a position the column was about to walk into. Messenger dogs ran communications between 2 handlers on a relay system. The dog knew both handlers would move between them on command and could carry information across distances where radio had failed and runners were too exposed. Sentry dogs worked the night perimeter positioned to alert before any approach became a breach. Mine detection was trained as well. In the Pacific, it proved impractical. The terrain, the conditions, the density of combat made it unworkable. What the Pacific required above all else was the scout at point. The breeds came largely from American Homes. A civilian organization called Dogs for Defense had been soliciting donations since January of 1942, founded by a poodle breeder, a newspaper reporter, and a professional dog handler. It became the primary pipeline for procuring animals for the military. Roughly 18,000 dogs were acquired nationally through the program. Approximately 10,400 completed training. Around 1,900 were deployed overseas. Of those, some 1,047 served in the Marine Corps. 7 Marine War Dog platoons would eventually form. The Doberman Pinscher dominated the USMC platoons. The reasons were practical short coat, suited to tropical heat athletic, build the trainability and intensity of temperament that made them responsive under stress without becoming unpredictable in it. The Doberman Club of America donated animals to the program specifically. The dog that would later stand in bronze on a hillside on Guam, the memorial that marks 25 names in the stone beneath it, was modeled on a Doberman. The movement of the 1st Marine War Dog Platoon from training to deployment was technically classified. The dogs and handlers traveled cross-country by train toward San Diego. The classification did not hold. At station stops along the route, civilians appeared on the platforms. With food for the dogs, word had traveled somehow, or simply the sight of a train car full of Dobermans with handlers in Marine Corps uniform had communicated something that did not require announcement. The dogs ate well on the journey west. The 1st Marine War Dog Platoon, 55 men, 24 dogs, 3 German Shepherds, and the rest Dobermans, departed San Diego on the 23rd of June, 1943. They arrived in the South Pacific on the 11th of July and staged at Guadalcanal. Before they shipped out the commander of the unit, they would be attached to Lieutenant Colonel Alan Shapley, reportedly addressed the handlers directly. I want you men to remember that the dogs are the least expendable of all. The reason Shapley said that was tactical, not sentimental. Each dog represented months of training, a handler relationship built over hundreds of hours, and a detection capability that no human being in the column could replicate. A Marine who was killed could be replaced by another Marine. The specific system that produced one trained scout dog bonded to one specific handler that could not be reconstituted in the field. Shapley's math was the math of sensors and redundancy. The dog at point was the only sensor in the column that could do what it did. The handler-dog bond was not incidental to the system. It was structural. A dog reads its handler through accumulated familiarity, the handler's baseline scent movement pattern, breathing rhythm, the specific texture of that person's emotional state. A dog that has spent 14 weeks in daily contact with one man develops a channel of communication invisible to everyone else in the patrol. Corporal Harold Tesh, a handler who deployed to the Pacific, described what this meant in practice. I could almost aim my rifle where he pointed, and the enemy would be there. Corporal Bruce Wellington described the relationship more simply. It's amazing what a bond you can get with a dog when you spend so much time with it. It's just like being brothers. On the 1st of November 1943, they landed at Bougainville. A Bougainville, the system works. On the 1st of November 1943, the 1st Marine War Dog Platoon landed at Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville, approximately 1 hour after the first assault wave. They brought 24 dogs into jungle, where visibility was under 10 yards, where the moisture had already destroyed half the radios, and where Japanese night infiltration had been killing Americans for 2 years. Bougainville is the largest island in the Solomon chain, roughly 3,600 square miles of volcanic interior, primary and secondary jungle river systems that flooded without warning, and terrain that absorbed manpower without returning it. In November of 1943, the island held an estimated 40,000 Japanese troops. The Marines were not landing to take it. The objective was narrower seize a beachhead at Empress Augusta Bay, large enough to build an airfield, close enough to Rabaul to put that base within strike range. The perimeter they needed to hold was in triple canopy jungle, cut by trails that connected the beach to the interior with waist-deep swamps within 30 yards of the high water mark, and a canopy dense enough that on a clear night you could stand under it and not see the stars. The Japanese had 2 years of experience on those trails. The Marines had been on the island for an hour. The 1st platoon was attached to the 2nd Marine Raider Regiment. Their primary function was scout a dog at point on every patrol that moved into the jungle interior, extending the column's awareness beyond what any human sense could manage in that terrain and at night. A trained scout dog working into a light wind in secondary growth jungle could detect a static human position at ranges that made the difference between a patrol column stopping in time and one walking into a kill zone with no warning and no exit. In the open, that range could extend to several hundred yards. In Bougainville's canopy, with humidity compressing the scent cone and rain washing the ground, it was less. It was still further than a Marine's eyes. The Piva Trail was the primary access route through the jungle, west of the beachhead, a narrow track overhung with vegetation on both sides, the kind of ground where a column must move in single file and cannot see more than a few yards to either side of the man ahead. Late in November, a Doberman named Andy was at point ahead of M Company, 250 Marines in column moving west. Andy's handlers were PFCs, Robert Lansley and John Mahoney. The column was moving at patrol speed, which in that terrain meant slowly spread out weapons, ready listening for anything that wasn't rain or insects. Andy froze at the tree line ahead, body rigid, hackles raised, nose sweeping left to right and back left right center, and then settling, pointing into the jungle on both sides of the trail. Lansley read it and signaled the column to stop. When Marines pushed through the undergrowth flanking the trail on both sides, they found machine guns. 2 positions interlocking fields of fire configured to sweep the trail at the height of a walking man. A crossfire kill zone designed for exactly the kind of column that had been about to enter it. 250 men in single file on a trail with no room to maneuver and nowhere to go. The ambush had been waiting for them. It did not fire. Andy had smelled the men in those positions, their sweat, their presence, the specific human scent of soldiers who had been lying in a static position in hot, wet jungle, long enough for their chemistry to saturate the air around them before the column reached the point where there was no stopping in time. The column walked out of that jungle alive. It would not have. That was one patrol. The tactical value of the system was not in any single incident. It was in the cumulative record built across the entire Bougainville deployment from the 1st of November 1943 to the 23rd of January 1944. Across those nearly 3 months, according to Marine after-action reports and subsequent historical reviews, no patrol led by a war dog was ambushed. Lieutenant Colonel Shapley filed the after-action report. It read, "Not one Marine was killed while in a Marine patrol led by a dog. Not one surprise attack occurred while dogs were on watch." That finding was later cited independently by the United States Army Military History Institute. In the latter theater, the Japanese never ambushed or made a surprise attack on a patrol led by one of the war dogs. Two separate official sources. Same finding. The system was also carrying messages. When the radio sets failed in the humidity, a recurring problem throughout the Pacific Island campaigns, where moisture infiltrated the electronics faster than field repair could address, the messenger dogs ran. A German shepherd named Caesar, handled by PFC Rufus Mayo, ran communications between Marine positions on the Bougainville perimeter. He ran 1,500 yards between handlers 9 separate times under active fire. He was shot 3 times. He survived surgery in a field station, was evacuated, returned to duty, and was later sent stateside for war bond tours. Caesar survived Bougainville. He did not survive the war. Bougainville cost the 1st Platoon 4 of its 59 members who did not return 2 dogs, 2 handlers. That is the toll for a deployment of nearly 3 months in jungle, where Japanese night infiltration had been the primary tactical problem for 2 years before the Marines arrived. The Japanese did not fail to understand what the dogs were doing. The accounts from multiple campaigns compiled in post-war after-action reviews describe a pattern that would hold from Bougainville forward. When a Japanese force intended to initiate contact with a Marine patrol, the targeting sequence changed. The dog first, then the handler, then the column. The tactical logic was straightforward: eliminate the sensor before the column can read it. It is the same logic that a unit uses when it fires at the radio operator or at the officer before engaging the enlisted men. Destroy the command and control node first. On Bougainville, the dogs were the node. The after-action record does not say the Japanese feared the dogs. It says they understood what the dogs were doing and developed a tactical response to it. Fear and recognition are not the same thing. One of them is in the documents. One of them is not. That distinction will matter later. Guam, July 1944. The price of working. On the 21st of July 1944, 3 Marine war dog platoons landed at Guam. 60 dogs. Lieutenant William Putney, commander of the 3rd Platoon, recorded that hundreds of patrols across the following weeks were led by war dogs. Contemporary accounts cite figures ranging from 450 to over 550. The zero ambush record already established at Bougainville held across all of them. Guam had been American territory since 1898. Japanese forces took it on the 10th of December, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, in an assault that overwhelmed the small garrison within hours. The American campaign to retake it in the summer of 1944 was part of the Mariana Islands operation. Securing the island chain would put B-29s within range of the Japanese home islands and cut the Pacific supply lines that Japanese forces further south depended on. Guam was the largest island in the chain and the one with the most developed infrastructure. The island is roughly 30 miles long, pinched at the waist by the Orote Peninsula, which divides the northern and southern halves. The American assault came simultaneously at 2 beaches, Asan Adalup in the north and Agat in the south, with the goal of encircling Orote and linking the 2 beachheads. The terrain between those landing points was steep ridgeline secondary growth jungle with visibility under 3 meters. Cave positions the Japanese garrison had spent 2.5 years improving, and draws and gullies that channeled movement into predictable corridors that favored the defenders who knew them and punished the attackers who did not. 3 platoons, 60 dogs. The Japanese on Guam had access to the same operational intelligence the American after-action reports were producing. They knew the Marine Dog Program existed. They knew what the dogs had done on Bougainville. The tactical response they had developed, target the dog first, the handler second, was already in place when the landing craft hit the beach. On day 2 of the battle, the 22nd of July, a 65-pound Doberman named Kurt froze on a narrow draw west of the Orote Peninsula. His handler was PFC Alan S. Jacobson, 3rd Marine Division. Kurt had detected a Japanese force in concealed positions in the undergrowth below the trail line, a company strength element positioned to engage a column moving through the draw. Jacobson read the alert. The Marines flanked the position. The engagement that followed was on Marine terms, not Japanese terms. The National Park Service account attributes to Kurt's alert the likely saving of 250 Marines. That is the NPS assessment, not a figure derived from a direct count, because the ambush that didn't spring cannot have its hypothetical casualties counted. But the positioning of the Japanese force and the size of the Marine element that would have walked into it make the figure consistent with the tactical situation. Kurt was wounded during the Japanese counterattack later that day. Mortar shrapnel struck his spine. The wound was not survivable. Putney operated through the night in field conditions while the supporting fleet's 14-inch naval guns fired on Japanese positions to the north and west, the concussion from each round traveling through the volcanic ground and into everything resting on it. Putney wrote about the night later. I soon knew it was no use, and cradled him in my arms to absorb through the night the jolts of those exploding 14-inch naval shells. Kurt died before dawn. Kurt was the first war dog killed on Guam. 24 more would follow before the island was secured. Of the 60 dogs that landed on July 21, 25, would not leave the island alive. 20 more were wounded in action. Only 15 survived the campaign without injury. That is a casualty rate of 42%, killed 75% killed or wounded among the 60. Those numbers were not only the product of terrain and general battlefield danger. Marine accounts indicate that Japanese troops learned to target the dog teams because they understood what the dogs were doing. An adversary that was not threatened by the dogs would not have devoted specific resources to killing them. A patrol on Guam with a war dog worked like this. The dog moved at point 10 to 20 yards ahead of the lead Marine on a long leash that gave it enough range to work the air without pulling the column into exposed ground. The handler watched the dog's ears, the set of its shoulders, the way its nose moved. The column watched the handler. Nothing the dog was doing was visible to anyone more than 2 men back in the line, which meant the entire intelligence of the forward element was channeled through 1 man reading 1 animal. At night in secondary jungle, where the canopy closed out the moon and the moisture killed the radios, the dog was the only sensor in the column that was still functioning. The dog record books maintained at the National Archives official logs kept for each animal in the program document what the individual dogs were doing across those weeks of fighting. Cookie's entry from the National Archives Record Group 127 reads, while on nightly security duty during the Guam operations, this dog alerted 10 Japanese soldiers, 6 of which were killed. This dog carried a vital message from an outpost to the Division CP, of which there were no other means of communication. 1 entry, 2 functions, both performed. The night of July 25th into the 26th produced 2 events that together constitute the clearest tactical argument for the program. The first, a black Labrador named Skipper handled by PFC Dale Fetzer, was on perimeter watch with Company C 1st Battalion 9th Marines. The time was approximately 0400 hours. Skipper alerted body rigid head turned toward the darkness beyond the wire. Fetzer passed the alert. Company C stood to arms. The Japanese assault that followed hit a company that was awake and ready. A grenade killed Skipper. Another fragment wounded Fetzer. In the fighting that followed, Company C sustained casualties. It did not sustain the casualties of a company taken by surprise at 0400 in the dark. Fetzer, by his own later account, killed every Japanese soldier he could find in the immediate aftermath. He was found sitting on the edge of his foxhole with Skipper's body across his arms, unable to speak the rage or grief, or both of it, having taken whatever words he had available. The second event of that night was larger in scale. A Japanese force of approximately 5,000 men launched a mass attack against the Marine lines, a banzai assault of the type that had ended previous island battles in catastrophic casualties on both sides. Before the assault reached the Marine positions, multiple war dogs alerted their handlers. The warning traveled down the line. The Marines were standing when the attack arrived. The attack failed. 5,000 men. The dogs heard them coming. That is the tactical argument in its clearest form. Skipper on a perimeter in the dark and 60 dogs across the Guam battlefield alerting before the 5,000-man assault reached the wire. Both documented. Both in the same campaign. The cost of the campaign was also specific. PFC Edward Topka was killed on the 22nd of July, the same day as Kurt's alert, after his dog Lucky had flagged the approach of Japanese soldiers. Lucky stood guard over Topka's body when the corpsman came to recover it. He snapped at them. He had to be physically subdued by multiple handlers before the body could be moved. Putney arranged for Lucky to be sent stateside. He wrote afterward, "Lucky was never the same." The pattern documented across Guam dogs, alerted handlers relayed columns, prepared before contact was also the pattern that made the dogs into priority targets. O'Brien in Naval History magazine quoted from a handler's account, "The Japanese knew the dog was doing them and tried and eventually nailed Caesar." Caesar, the German shepherd from Bougainville, the one the Marine Corps had sent on war bond tours, was eventually killed on Guam. The dog that had survived 3 gunshot wounds on one island was killed on the next one. 25 names are inscribed on a stone at the War Dog Cemetery at the Naval Station on Guam. Kurt Skipper, Blitz, Nig Missy, Birch, Yanni Poncho, Prince Amo, Cappy Pepper, Coco, Tubby Fritz, Duke Silver, Ludwig Bunky, Ricky Hobo, Emmy, Max Brocky Tam. They were originally buried along the Asan River near where the fighting was heaviest. They stayed there for 50 years. 8 months after Guam was secured, the program moved to a different kind of island, and a problem it had not encountered before. Iwo Jima, when the system fails and what it does instead. On the 19th of February 1945, the 6th and 7th Marine War Dog platoons landed at Iwo Jima. The island smelled of sulfur. 8 square miles of volcanic black rock and black sand, no vegetation, open terrain, under direct observation and fire from 11 miles of interconnected Japanese tunnels that ran beneath the surface like a second island. Iwo Jima was in the tactical sense the opposite of every environment the Marine War Dog program had been built for. The dogs had been trained to work in jungle. Jungle provided the conditions. Their detection capability depended on scent cones carried on still air under a canopy sound insulation that amplified the specific noise of a body moving through undergrowth, the natural screening that forced attackers to move through predictable corridors and allowed a dog at point to work those corridors ahead of the column. None of those conditions existed at Iwo Jima. The island was open. The noise was constant and overwhelming artillery naval gunfire aircraft, the sustained percussion of the largest marine assault in the Pacific War, and noise at that volume saturates a dog's sensory environment in ways that compress its effective range. The terrain was volcanic rock and sulfurous soil, and the sulfur created an olfactory environment that interfered with scent discrimination. And there was another problem the program had not encountered in any previous deployment: the dead. Japanese defenders who were killed at or near the surface in the cave openings on the forward slopes in the open ground between tunnel exits lay where they fell. Within days of the landing, the terrain was littered with dead bodies, Japanese and American, in concentrations that varied unpredictably across the 8 square miles of the island. Dogs trained to alertly on the presence of human beings alert on dead humans as well as living ones. At Iwo Jima, a dog that alerted could be flagging a position with living Japanese soldiers or the bodies of soldiers already killed. The handler had no way to read the dog's alert with the same confidence it had carried at Bougainville and Guam, because the alert meant something different here, and neither the handler nor the dog could resolve the ambiguity from the alert alone. The after-action assessment was direct. The official USMC review of the Iwo Jima deployment stated, "Conditions on Iwo did not warrant the extensive use of dogs." That sentence appears in the documentary record as a statement of operational fact, not failure. The Marine program had been built around what dogs could actually do, not what they could be made to represent. Knowing where the design stops working is part of building honestly. Iwo Jima was where it stopped working in the mode it had operated in on Bougainville and Guam. The program adapted. The 6th Platoon developed a new doctrine on the ground: find and clear. Dogs were used not to move at point ahead of a patrol in open terrain, a function the environment made impractical, but to approach cave openings and tunnel exits and identify which ones contained living Japanese. The dog's nose, even in the sulfur environment, could distinguish between a dead body and a living occupant at closer range than it could maintain effective point work across open ground. When the dog alerted at a cave entrance, Marines cleared the position with grenades and flamethrowers. The dog identified the target. The Marines destroyed it. The integration of the two systems, canine detection and flamethrower, appeared here at Iwo Jima more explicitly than in any previous campaign. The terrain itself was unlike anything in the program's prior deployments. The black volcanic sand shifted underfoot and cut into paws that had been conditioned for jungle mud and coral. The sulfur vents that gave the island its name, Iwo Jima, means Sulphur Island in Japanese, produced a low, persistent odor that saturated the ground and everything moving on it. A dog working into a sulfur-laced wind was working in a degraded sensory environment. In the same way a human sniper works through heat shimmer, the capability remains, but the precision is reduced. The dogs at Iwo Jima were not broken. They were operating at diminished effectiveness in conditions the program had not been designed for, and the after-action assessment said so plainly. There is a photograph taken on Iwo Jima that has been reproduced widely since the war. PFC Res, P. Hester of the 7th War Dog Platoon, napping on the black volcanic sand, his helmet tipped forward over his face, his rifle across his chest. A Doberman named Butch stands guard over him, alert upright, facing the open ground. The photograph was taken by Staff Sergeant M. Kaufman and is held in the National Archives as File Number 127-N-1-10104. It is widely described as showing a handler resting while his dog keeps watch. What it actually shows is a dog doing its job in one of the few ways the Iwo Jima environment permitted stationary sentry close guard alert. The jungle was gone. The tunnel system rendered point patrol nearly useless. The dog was still watching. The first night on the island cost both platoons. PFC James. E. Wallace, a handler, was killed by a mortar round. A dog named Fritz was wounded by shrapnel. A dog named King was wounded. A dog named Duke was killed by a sniper. That is the first night. The Japanese targeting pattern documented across Bougainville and Guam held at Iwo Jima. The dogs still alerted. A Doberman named Carl, handled by PFC Raymond N. Moqueen, alerted 30 minutes before a banzai attack on the Marine perimeter. The alert came on a night when nothing visible was moving on terrain where visibility extended further than any previous campaign, but where the tunnel system allowed Japanese forces to approach from unexpected directions. Moquin later described it, "There was nothing out there. We even tried to calm Carl down, but he wouldn't. Then All hell broke loose with a screaming banzai attack coming right up out of the ground. We were ready, thanks to Carl. Coming right up out of the ground. The attack emerged from tunnel exits rather than from across open terrain, the specific tactic General Kuribayashi had designed Iwo Jima's defenses around. Carl had detected the movement through the tunnel system through the volcanic rock and sulfurous soil 30 minutes before it surfaced. That is what the system could still do at Iwo Jima under the conditions that had degraded everything else it had done before. The Iwo Jima deployment is the intellectually honest chapter in the Marine War dog story. The after-action review did not claim the dogs had been decisive. It noted the conditions that limited them and documented what they had contributed within those limits. Carl's 30-minute warning is in the record. The find and clear cave identifications are in the record. The first night handler killed by a mortar is in the record. None of it is dressed up. At Iwo Jima, the program was operating with reduced scope by deliberate design, fewer patrols, more targeted deployment, the find and clear function taking the place of point work across open ground. The after-action report did not count the Iwo Jima dog casualties the way Guam had been counted because the operational role had changed. What it recorded was what the dogs had actually contributed cave identification perimeter alerts. Carl's 30-minute warning before the tunnel breach banzai. A system that knows its own limits and operates within them is a system that can be trusted. The Marine Dog program had earned that characterization across 3 islands and 2 years of fighting. The men from Cat Island were already in Europe by the time the 6th and 7th platoons landed at Iwo Jima. They had been there for 2 years. What happened to Rei Nosaka? Rei Nosaka was 26 years old when he climbed into the swamps of Cat Island. He had been at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed, had heard the aircraft and seen the smoke, and understood, along with every other American on Oahu, that Sunday morning what the smoke meant. He had volunteered to serve anyway. He had been stripped of his right to bear arms, along with every other Japanese-American man in the military after Pearl Harbor then had that right restored. Then been inducted into the 100th Infantry Battalion and shipped to the mainland. He had been escorted by MPs through New Orleans to a classified program on a Mississippi barrier island and told that whatever happened there, he could not speak of it for 10 years. In March of 1943, when the program was shut down without explanation, Nosaka was transferred to Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He was going to Italy. The experiment that had used him as a subject was simply over. He carried it sealed, unspoken, across the Atlantic. The 10-year silence he had been ordered to keep was still running. On the 6th of November, 1944, exactly 2 years after his arrival in New Orleans, Nosaka was wounded in Italy. The date is a coincidence of the calendar. It is noted here as a coincidence only. He had served for 2 years in a war he had volunteered for after being treated as a security risk, after being used as bait in a pseudo-scientific experiment, after being ordered to hurt animals he did not want to hurt on instructions he was not allowed to question. He was wounded in Italy on the exact date that marked 2 years of that. The 100th Infantry Battalion had been fighting in Italy since September of 1943. In June of 1944, it was absorbed into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a larger Nisei unit that combined soldiers from the 100th with volunteers from across the mainland internment camps, men who had been removed from their homes by executive order, and then asked to serve the government that had removed them. Many had said yes. The 442nd fought in Italy, and then in France, and then in Germany. What they did there produced a record that has been cited by every subsequent American president who has addressed the unit, because the record is genuinely difficult to summarize without the summary sounding like embellishment. It is not embellishment. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated American military unit for its size and length of service in United States history. 21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, over 4,000 Purple Hearts Some unit histories cite as many as 9,486 for the combined 100th/442nd, more than 18,000 individual decorations in total. Their motto was "Go for Broke," a Hawaii Pidgin gambling phrase meaning to wager everything on a single hand. They had, in the most literal sense, done that. In October of 2010, President Obama signed the Congressional Gold Medal Act into law in a ceremony at the Oval Office. 6 Nisei veterans were present among them: Senator Daniel K. Inouye of Hawaii, who had served with the 442nd and lost his right arm in Italy. The legislation authorized the highest civilian honor Congress can award to the men of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. On the 2nd of November 2011, the physical medals were presented at a ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. The citation acknowledged what the men had done in combat and what they had endured before it. The gold medal is the institutional recognition, and it arrived 67 years after the 442nd entered combat and nearly 7 decades after 27 men were escorted by MPs to a classified experiment on a Mississippi island and ordered not to speak of what they saw. They are 2 distinct events, the legislation and the ceremony signed 13 months apart, easy to conflate, worth keeping separate. The law came first. The medal came after. Both came long after the men who earned them. Rei Nosaka's specific presence at the ceremony is not confirmed in the accessible record. He would have been in his late 80s. What is confirmed is that the 27 men who participated in Cat Island were eventually part of the unit that received the medal, and that the medal citation does not mention Cat Island, because Cat Island was classified for a decade and has never been a central part of the 442nd's institutional narrative. It remains a footnote to a story that is itself incompletely told. The dogs trained by Honest Method saved hundreds of Marines across 4 years of Pacific Island fighting. The men degraded by Dishonest Method went to Europe and came home with the most decorated record in American military history. Neither group was given what they were owed at the time. Both are in the record now. What the record shows. At the end of the war, the Marine Corps issued an order. Of the 559 war dogs still alive, all were to be euthanized. The reasoning was institutional. These were military working animals trained for combat, and returning them to civilian households was considered a risk the Corps was not equipped to manage. The order was signed and distributed. Lieutenant William Putney refused to sign a single death certificate. He had commanded the 3rd Marine War Dog Platoon at Guam. He had operated on Kurt through a naval bombardment and held him until he died. He had sent Lucky stateside when the dog could no longer function after Topka's death. He had seen what the dogs had done, campaign by campaign, in conditions that destroyed radios and outpaced human senses and produced casualty rates that reflected how seriously the enemy had taken the threat the dogs represented. Putney was also a veterinarian. He believed the dogs could be returned to civilian life if properly handled, and he said so. He launched a detraining program. Detraining took time and was not guaranteed. A dog conditioned for combat, desensitized to artillery, trained to alert on human presence, bonded to a handler in a relationship built on the specific intensity of shared danger, does not simply step back into suburban life because the war is over. Putney knew this. He designed the program for it. Of the 559 dogs, 540 were successfully placed, returned to their original families, where those families could be found or adopted permanently by the handlers they had served alongside. 15 were euthanized for health reasons unrelated to behavior. Only 4 could not be safely returned to civilian life after all detraining efforts were exhausted. 4 out of 559. Less than 1%. Putney's assessment of the dogs he had commanded, delivered after the war, was, "I can tell you these are some of the greatest warriors the Marine Corps ever fielded." He went on to become president of the California Veterinary Medical Association and later Los Angeles Commissioner of Animal Regulation. He received the Purple Heart and Silver Star for his service on Guam. He died in 2003 in San Diego at the age of 83. On the 21st of July, 1994, 50 years to the day after the Guam landing, the United States Marine Corps dedicated the National War Dog Cemetery at the Naval Station on Guam. The ceremony was presided over by USMC Commandant Carl E. Mundy, who formally designated all war dogs as Marines. A bronze sculpture was unveiled, a Doberman standing at alert on a low plinth modeled on Kurt, created by sculptor Susan Beharry Wilner. Behind the bronze, a stone wall. 25 names in the stone: Kurt, Skipper, Blitz, Nig, Missy, Birch, Yoni, Poncho, Prince, Amo, Cappy, Pepper, Coco, Tubby, Fritz, Duke, Silver, Ludwig, Bunky, Ricky, Hobo, Emmy, Max, Brocky, Tam. The title of this documentary makes a claim that Japanese soldiers feared American war dogs more than the Flamethrower. The claim circulates widely. It appears in YouTube thumbnails and history listicles and casual conversation about the Pacific War. We spent months looking for the source of it. We found no Japanese primary document that confirms it, no prisoner interrogation transcript, no captured diary. What we found was the opposite: a systematic Japanese effort to hunt and kill the dog teams because those teams were alerting patrol columns before any ambush could be sprung. Not fear, recognition. Calculated, persistent, and expensive for both sides. What is documented is this. 2 programs started in November of 1942. One asked what a dog could smell about the enemy, and was built on the premise that race produces a distinctive biological signal a dog can be trained to hunt. It lasted only a few months as an attack dog experiment. It used a detachment of Nisei soldiers as human subjects against their will and ordered them not to speak of it for a decade. It failed because the premise was false, and the premise was false from the beginning. The other program asked what a dog could detect movement presence approach the specific human chemistry of a body in static position in hot jungle, and built a system around a handler reading a dog, reading the terrain ahead. It ran for 4 years across multiple islands. No patrol it led was ever ambushed. Its dogs were targeted and killed at high rates by an adversary that understood their value and tried to eliminate it. It produced a documented record that 2 separate official sources have confirmed. 2 programs, same month, same question. The one built on a false premise failed in 4 months and left 27 men with a secret. The one built on an honest premise never lost a patrol. The design worked because the question was honest.